Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're logging on from in the world. And welcome to this second event, second webinar taking place as part of Decarbonising Transport Week, the UK's official National Awareness Week, sponsored by Trojan Energy and McDonald. Thanks to those two organisations for their support for this week's activities. And also thanks to all of our partners, with details of which you can find on the decarbonisingtransportweek.com website, and as well as a lot more besides. So do take a visit to the website. This morning's session, and my name is Andy Walker, I'm an infrastructure journalist. I'll be chairing this session. This morning's session is a roundtable session entitled Driving the Future, Accelerating the UK's zero emission transition, and we'll be focusing to a fairly large extent on the roads sector. And we've got a fantastic panel who will provide some real insights into the UK's journey towards zero emission road transport. We've got Dr. Alistair Barnes, who's the Senior Programme Manager Land and Maritime Transport at Innovate UK. We've got Tom Parke, who's an associate at the Green Finance Institute, and also Professor Phil Blythe CBE, who's Professor of Intelligent Transport Systems at Newcastle University, and also runs a very interesting transport-related organisation, which I'm sure he will talk about when he speaks. First up, we've got Dr. Alistair Barnes, who, as I said, is Senior Programme Manager at the Land and Maritime, for Land and Maritime Transport at Innovate UK, and he's responsible currently for over £200 million worth of programmes. And I know that Alistair is going to talk a little bit about the UK zero emission HGV and infrastructure demonstrations, which are now underway, and the contribution that they're making to the overall decarbonisation of the nation's transport. So, Alistair, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and it's good to be here today amongst this panel. So, as you said, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to kick us off and talk around the UK's zero-emission HGV and infrastructure demonstration programme. The projects are now underway, and this feeds towards the UK's commitment to phase out the sale of non-zero emission HGVs by 2035 and 2040, depending on the weight classification. So there's lots of good work happening at the moment around decarbonising heavy duty transport. There's a push towards sustainable fuels and alternative fuels, but in the long run, the objective is to reach zero tailpipe emissions. So this programme is feeding towards that work. We have 4 high-profile funded projects with around £200 million of government funding, and total investment, including the government and private investment, of well over £350 million. So this is a really sizable investment, and part of the work will be to build HGV recharging and hydrogen refuelling stations, which will accompany the deployment of around 370 zero tailpipe emission heavy goods vehicles. And the key aim here is to understand how this all works in practice and learn as much as possible and try and spread that learning around the industry. So we have Ricardo engaged to study the programme and to share the work, to share the learning widely, and they will start to report on what we're doing as soon as possible, hopefully before the end of this year. And I also want to say that Innovate UK does a lot of work in this area around transport decarbonisation, both on road, on rail, in the air and maritime. And one of the things we've done recently is published our Transport Vision 2050 document. We published it the first time 2.5 years ago, and it's just last week been refreshed and updated. It's a really interesting document that I encourage people to take a look at. It looks at how we think the future will be in 2050 and then the decades along the way, and it covers digital, energy vectors, transport demand, and various different topics. We sort of split into enablers and pathways to kind of understand how those will change over the coming years. So a really interesting document. We've possibly lost our chair. So maybe it makes sense for Tom to go next and just have your update.
Sure, thanks, Alistair. Yeah, and also really great to be here. So at the Green Finance Institute, we are focused on how finance can be an enabler of the transition. So we're really focused on identifying and unlocking the barriers to green finance and accelerating the transition to net zero. So if we're looking at heavy goods vehicles, which is my focus at the moment at the GFI, we are really focused on unlocking the 100 billion investment opportunity to transition HGVs in the UK to zero emission. So last year, the road transport team that I'm part of, we expanded our focus to include heavy goods vehicles. HGVs amongst the most polluting vehicles. I think one HGV, if you take one HGV and you electrify it, that's the equivalent to taking about 24 or 25 cars off the road. And the good news is, as Alistair's already alluded to, there's technology available that can help do this, not just at the lighter end, but the heavier end as well. The problem, though, at the moment is that companies don't have access to the right financing they need to buy these trucks, which are much more expensive, or to install the charging infrastructure that they need. So I think there's only one or two publicly accessible HGV charge points in the UK, and there's at the end of last year, I think there was less than 1,000 zero emission trucks on UK roads out of the 500,000 or so HGVs in the UK. So that's why at the GFI we published our report at the end of last year, setting out 10 innovative financing solutions that could help us make that transition to zero emission HGVs and install the infrastructure. And many of those solutions that we propose, they are helpful for smaller operators, which is really crucial, as in the UK about half the HGVs are owned by SMEs. And what we're focused on at the GFI is taking forward some of these solutions and partnering with organisations to deliver pilot schemes or demonstrator projects to show that they can be used to channel private capital at pace and scale.
Thanks very much for that, Tom, and sorry that my system seemed to go down at some point there, but you were listening to Tom Parke, the associate from the Green Finance Institute, and we'll be hearing from Tom a little bit more shortly when we get to the question and answer session. Next up, we've got Phil Blythe, who's a Professor of Intelligent Transport Systems at Newcastle University, and he's going to talk about some of the challenges associated with the recent setting up an award of the DARE Hub, which is the national hub supporting government and other stakeholders to deliver and co-create the evidence to enable us as a nation to better understand this whole area of activity. So Phil, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, we were recently awarded the DARE Hub jointly by UKRI, the National Research Council, and Department for Transport. And what's really interesting about this hub, it's not just looking at the decarbonisation of infrastructure, but it's looking at how we can adapt that infrastructure to deal with the challenges of climate change as extreme weather kicks in, and the resilience. What I find quite fascinating about that is the fact that sometimes the demands for decarbonisation, like moving down the electrification route for road vehicles, may, in fact, make our transport infrastructure less resilient because we're reliant on a new energy vector of electricity and all the vagaries of the generation and distribution of that. So we've got this really complex project. It's led by Newcastle University. It also includes Cambridge University, Glasgow, and Heriot-Watt, and a whole bunch of stakeholders from local authorities, national government bodies, industry, and others. I'm really trying to understand what the real challenges are, and particularly at that local level that people don't really consider that often, because it's the local authorities that really understand what are the problems of decarbonisation and resilience now. And through work we're doing, we can hopefully help predict what that what the challenges will be in the future in terms of when extreme weather kicks in, and we have models that will predict that in different areas. So a whole bunch of stuff with lots of different challenges and lots of different interactions, and actually just understanding that interaction of all those different risks together is something that hasn't really been done before. So we're hoping we're going to contribute to that wider picture through this hub.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Phil. I'm just going to kick things off from a questions point of view by turning to Tom Parke from the Green Finance Institute to begin with. How can finance help overcome the potential high upfront cost of zero-emission trucks, which is currently a significant barrier to adoption?
Yeah, so as you say, at the moment, these zero-emission trucks are significantly more expensive. So if you're looking at battery electric, it's typically 2 or 3 times more the diesel equivalent, and then hydrogen fuel cell is even more than that. So the financial sector can help operators that want to adopt these vehicles by providing them with the financial products that they need to help spread that cost over the duration that they're using the asset. And obviously that's nothing new. Many operators are already using finance to do that, or leases. But the problem is when you're thinking about zero emission vehicles, is that it's a very nascent market. So at the moment, because there are so few of these trucks, lenders aren't sure what they're going to be worth in the future. So when they're setting the future residual value, which is the value of the asset when at the end of the finance contract, they're basically assuming that there's not going to be much value left. And what this means is that the truck operator who is acquiring the vehicle then has to pay for the full depreciation of the asset, which increases the monthly finance cost, and that then impacts the total cost of ownership, which is the key metric that operators use when they're deciding what truck they're going to buy. So one solution to this that we propose in our report is the idea of a residual value guarantee. And so this is, if a guarantee is provided by a third party or by government to lenders to basically guarantee them against some of this, the risk, the residual value risk, that can enable lenders to set a higher residual value, and that reduces basically the monthly costs for operators who are acquiring these trucks. And so that's something that a residual value guarantee is something that we're interested in exploring at the Green Finance Institute as a way of potentially enabling greater levels of adoption in the UK.
Thanks, Tom. I'll come back to that because I've got some thoughts on or some questions on risk as well. But I just want to turn to Alistair, if I may. We've heard there from Tom that obviously there are some, fundamentally it's a bit more difficult to decarbonise HGVs. I mean, in your view, how much more difficult is it to decarbonise them? I mean, I guess it's much harder than cars, but probably easier than aviation. But, how do we sort of get to grips with all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd sell it the same way, right, Andy? It's a big challenge, but it's one that's quite achievable. Probably with today's technology, we don't need to invent any incredible new battery or a new type of technology to do this. It's largely achievable with today's technology and the technology that's coming in the very near future. So it is difficult. Passenger cars, I think, are much easier, and we see much more uptake now, and the price differential is coming down. As Tom said a moment ago, a zero-emission HGV will be probably 2 or 3 or maybe 4 times the cost of a diesel HGV today, and that will change over time. But fundamentally, there's a lot of new technology being used. So it is difficult, but it is significantly easier, I think, than maybe maritime and definitely aerospace decarbonisation. So it's a big challenge, but it's a very achievable challenge. It's one that will take a long time. We're right at the beginning of, but it's certainly achievable.
Thanks very much for that, Phil. I know that you're looking at kind of a number of issues, quite a lot of issues actually, but resilience and climate change in particular seem like two distinct problems. Why look at those together?
Okay, well, the issue is that climate change is going to create greater extremes of weather, whether it be high temperature, whether it be wind, whether it be more rainfall and the like. And that has a real impact on our transport infrastructure. Our transport infrastructure was designed to operate within certain bounds of temperature, for example, and it was built in places where there were certain amounts of rainfall. As that rainfall potentially increases, that they have the issues of flooding. As you have more extremes of temperature, particularly heating, you've got challenges with road infrastructure melting, deforming. The same for rail and overhead cables and the like. So it's trying to look at the things together. We need to decarbonise, and we need to make sure our future infrastructure is decarbonising, but we need to make sure that it stays resilient. So I mentioned one example of electrification may reduce the resilience of transport, but will contribute to decarbonisation. We also think about all these new materials we're trying to bring into the civil engineering space for transport, such as decarbonised concrete, the use of composites rather than steel. That's great because they have much lower carbon footprint in their manufacture and in their installation, but at this point in time, we're not 100% sure whether they will really contribute to the long-term resilience of infrastructure. You've also got the challenges. Some infrastructure may be in places where in 20, 30 years' time, it's not viable to keep it there because of flooding or some other issue. So you may have to make decisions on what infrastructure to keep. The infrastructure you do have, can you make it resilient to climate change? Is that resilient in the fact that it may fail due to flooding or heat or whatever, but recover quickly, so it doesn't have a massive impact on economy and on society? Or do we need to make that, is that infrastructure so critical, we need to design it in a way that it's almost resilient to the worst things that climate change can throw at us? And there's a massive cost associated with that. So it's trying to balance all those balls and actually understand what is best and providing guidance and tools and models to help local authorities and government test all those what-ifs.
Thanks, Phil. I want to turn to an issue now that's actually, I'm sure it'll come up in all of the sessions that we have during the course of Decarbonising Transport Week, and it certainly came up in our last session on rail, and that's the role of alternative fuels. And I just wonder, from the trials that are being done, I'll ask this question to Alistair first, and then I'll move on to Tom, whether or not there is a viable low carbon fuel that actually, would work, would be cost effective, and also your view as well on the whole area of biofuels as well. Are we likely to see that increase as a source going forward? So sorry, kick that one off with Alistair.
Sure, thank you, Andy. I guess I have quite a straightforward view here, so it's maybe quite a short answer in that in the short term, yes, biofuels or alternative fuels can reduce the emissions in the truck space. People talk a lot about HVO, hydrotreated vegetable oil, as a sort of drop-in replacement for diesel, and it's definitely important. But in the longer run, there are, because you can electrify and solve the decarbonisation challenge with heavy goods vehicles more simply, that there'll be those alternative fuels will be needed in other areas. So they will be for maritime, they will be very important, and I think it's likely that people will pay more for them in that sector. They are fundamentally limited by the amount that we can produce, so they will help, but they are not a solution in the longer run, sort of 10, 20 years away, that they will be needed elsewhere and we won't have the volume to do both of them. Thanks,
Alistair. Tom, what's your view on that?
Very much the same as Alistair, really. So just to echo, there's huge amounts of challenge in ensuring that the sustainable fuel option that you opt for is truly sustainable. And the problem is that if you grow the demand for these low carbon fuels too quickly, then you increase the risk that they're actually going to come from a non-sustainable source. So, as Alistair said, you know, there is no silver bullet when it comes to decarbonisation, and all technologies do have a role, but fundamentally in the long term, the focus really is what's zero emission at the tailpipe, and that's either going to be battery electric or hydrogen.
Thanks, Tom. Phil, I mean, you deal with a lot of stakeholders in the work that you do, and the work of the Dare Hub it's quite a wide remit. What kind of insights are you getting from dealing with all those stakeholders, and also how do you actually, you know, physically, how are you able to make sure that you can actually ascertain all of that information from all those differing, diverse stakeholders and then feed it back for the common good?
Okay, well, being a hub, we have a lot of stakeholders who signed up to this when we submitted the proposal, but now it's actually up and running. We're bringing in all the national expertise that we can from all these different sectors into the hub, and we hold stakeholder meetings to try and capture that. Looking at the discussions you're having on HGVs, we see logistics as a key element of resilience and the challenges for transport. We saw with Brexit and we saw with COVID that if your logistics fails, you've got a real issue for society. I don't think people appreciated how fragile it is, particularly with just a few links to Europe that we use. And also we want that logistics to be decarbonised. I know you've been talking about largely electrification of HGVs and possibly fuel cells. I do think hydrogen has a role to play in HGVs, but we're kind of 15 years behind in our thinking of hydrogen as to where we are with electrification. You know, in 2010, when we moved down the electrification path, 1 kilowatt hour of battery storage was about $1,500. The electricity grid was about 800-900 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour generated, so it wasn't very clean. But because you've got that clear steer from government to move forward, you've got the innovators and the investors in, so now 1 kilowatt hour of battery storage less than $200. The electricity in the grid, the carbon in the grid is about 180 grams of CO2. I think similar things can happen with hydrogen. We've been doing quite a lot of work with the MOD to look at how a lot of their green fleet could be converted to be tailpipe emission reduced running on hydrogen, but not necessarily hydrogen fuel cells, but running hydrogen in the engines directly and burning it. There was a DFT meeting last week where JCB demonstrated a hydrogen engine for one of their new diggers, where it burned rather than a hydrogen fuel cell, because it has a better operating temperature range, for example. So I think we shouldn't discount that as well. Totally agree with the point about the drop-in fuels. I don't think they're a long-term solution in road transport for many reasons, and in particular they've got alternatives, but also they're not always as carbon-free as we think.
Thanks, Phil. Interesting you say there, you thought that we were kind of behind the times, or behind in terms of the thinking around hydrogen. And I just want to ask Tom from the Green Finance Institute, how do we ensure that, because obviously it's risky when you're investing in any kind of new area, how do we on the one hand facilitate the flow of finance required to fund the charging infrastructure that we need, but also how do we actually influence or get people to invest in some of these hydrogen technologies where we maybe aren't as far forward as we ought to be at the present time? And is there a role for government in that as well?
That's a good question. So yeah, well, one thing that we are interested, one thing that we're focusing on at the Green Finance Institute is the potential role for blended finance. So as you say, the role for government providing capital to de-risk private capital. And we've seen that across many different sectors, having a role in doing that. And certainly when it comes to these new technologies, that can be crucial, and it can be a much more effective use of public funding than grant funding can. So one area that we are interested in particularly is ways to scale up the battery supply chain in the UK, because that's a key part of growing the electric side, and equally when it comes to developing hydrogen technologies, that also plays a role. So yes, there's definitely a role for public funding to de-risk those new investments.
Just turning to you, Alistair. It's interesting there was made mention of the of a kind of battery industry, because we've had some success stories over here. We've also had some less than success stories in terms of factories not opening. How is the UK doing compared to Europe and further afield in the whole area of decarbonising HGVs, and what role is the the whole battery industry, what role does that have in relation to that, and where we are in terms of our competitors?
Sure, and that's a really big question, right? There is in the UK we've had some successes, we've had some not so successful elements, but it's a global challenge in that there is a huge need for production capacity. But then every factory you build needs factories to produce the input materials, the cathode active materials and things like that go into the batteries. So in terms of this sort of global transition, it's a massive change affecting huge industries and tens of thousands of people. So yes, there's definitely work to be done. In terms of how we're doing in the UK compared to Europe and further afield, I think you could look at it from two angles. You could talk about the policy, and you could talk about how we're doing in terms of actual deployments. And I think the UK has shown, particularly for heavy duty vehicles, has shown sort of clear, stable policy direction around those phase out dates. They've been in place for a couple of years now. They're quite a long way away, but they're quite clear and simple to understand goals. The UK, I think, was the first developed country in the world to publicise those phase out dates, and certainly ahead of Europe, who's only in the last couple of months been really talking about setting firm targets. So in terms of policy, I think the UK is doing really well. And then the next challenge, I think, is around actual deployment. And to some extent, a lot of the companies that are involved in buying these vehicles and producing these vehicles are multinational, and they will go where the most funding is. So Germany in recent years has had a lot of funding to enable uptake of decarbonised heavy goods vehicles. I think that may have changed over recent weeks, but certainly the funding landscape is helping to attract people to where governments really want it to happen. So the UK's effort isn't around a big discount on the purchase price of vehicles, but we do have that large investment into demonstrator vehicles, and that is to understand how they all work in practice at scale, and that will hopefully feed towards making sure that we can help this transition happen in the most cost-effective and rapid way possible.
Thanks, Alistair. You mentioned there, you talked about some of the large-scale operators. I want to look at, because a lot of what happens on the HGV side in the UK is maybe smaller operators. And I just want to ask Tom, how can finance support smaller businesses, in particular, adopt zero-emission trucks? What's your view on that?
Sure. So the key thing when it comes to smaller businesses is increasing the access to finance. So typically, smaller operators are much more likely to acquire their trucks using cash, and much less likely than the larger operators are to use finance. So one solution that we propose to this in our report is the idea of a small operator loan guarantee. Again, something potentially provided by government or by a third party. And this is basically something that's been trialled really successfully in California. And this was where the state government provided a guarantee to lenders in the state who were offering loans to smaller operators who were acquiring lower emission trucks or retrofitting their existing trucks with lower emission engines. And it was a really successful scheme. It encouraged a huge amount of uptake, reducing carbon emissions, and then from the perspective of the guarantee, there was a relatively low default rate when it came to the actual loans themselves. And as I mentioned before, the idea of public capital leveraging larger amounts of private finance, I think this guarantee scheme leveraged something like 10 times the amount of private finance. So clearly hugely effective in enabling smaller operators to access lower emission technologies. And that's something that we're interested to explore, whether it's feasible in the UK.
Thanks, Tom. There's obviously a lot of work there going on across the sector about what works, what doesn't work. And I know that Phil's Dare Hub has a key responsibility to make sure that the outcomes and the findings that you discover from the work that you're doing are not just used, but are actually usable by stakeholders, local authorities, regional authorities, and the industries that deliver and maintain the transport infrastructures. How do you think you'll be doing that going forward? And how is that going to work in practice?
Okay, I mean, this isn't like a usual academic hub where the academics go away in their ivory towers and produce some models and results, and that's it, and we can go and publish. And this is really something to try and deliver for the UK, and that's really, really important. So by working with the stakeholders who will actually have to use the outputs, whether they be models, tools, or just our findings and our evidence, we've got to make sure that it's in a form that they're able to use, they're able to maybe run the models and test different scenarios, test different what ifs. So part of the engagement is to ensure that we are delivering on that, and that's really, really important, because if these findings are not accessible, we failed, because this is not an academic problem. This is a problem for everybody. So one example of what we've been doing recently, we've been looking at road infrastructure. So we've partnered with the CIHT, Chartered Institute of Highways and Transport, to do a rapid study on what is needed to understand what is the future resilience of road building and road maintenance, because local authorities really don't have much of a clue of how do they make that decarbonised and resilient in the future. So we're working on that, and we're going to produce a report at the end of October, which will kind of be the first one out of Dare to say, here are all the issues, here are the costs of doing it this way, making this decision, or doing it this way, making that decision. And by the way, if you make that decision, this might have such implication on resilience, might have such implication on the performance of the roads, etc. So that's really, really important, and critically important for, we're talking about freight and logistics, because they are very, very heavy vehicles. So if there are failures of the road network, it's going to be a failure for them first, and that has the wider impacts on the economy and society if we can't get our logistics systems working efficiently.
Thanks very much, Phil. So, I mean, again, highlighting the need for that joined up approach really across the piece. I just want to go back to Alistair, because it seems to me that, yes, there's progress being made, but there's still an awful lot more progress that needs to be made. I mean, from your perspective, how can we really accelerate heavy duty transport decarbonisation in the UK? If you had to, if you had, the minister in the room with us now, what would you be stressing on them?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of things that we really need to do, we're already doing. So I think that's quite positive, especially given that this is still very, very early days. So, I mean, if I kind of bullet point a couple, the zero emission HGV and infrastructure demonstration program that I've talked about extensively, it's really good to be working with the Department for Transport on that. It's one of their key policies, very important in terms of figuring out what we need to do to be most effective. So that's one angle. Another is the Department for Transport's HGV and HGV infrastructure strategy, which I think is due to be published in coming months. A third could be around grid upgrades. So we've talked about battery vehicles and hydrogen vehicles. It's pretty clear now that battery vehicles are going to take the vast majority of the, I don't know what to call it, decarbonisation potential. They're going to be the biggest player in terms of decarbonising HGVs. And we know to do that we will need sort of a sweeping effort around grid upgrades and improving access to power in certain places. So I think that's a very straightforward and sort of simple thing to propose. How we actually do it, I think, is more difficult, but it's definitely needs to have that objective in there. And then maybe another one is around consistent policy. So those sort of phase out dates have been public for quite a few years now, and they need to stay, and we need to sort of continue working out how to do it as opposed to moving the goalposts. And then maybe a final one is around celebrating success. So there is plenty that can be done now, and there are plenty of operators, both small and large, who are doing this already. And I think there's a lot of work we can do to tell people about what can be done, how to do it most effectively. And that's one of the things Innovate UK is keen on promoting. We have an event in a couple of weeks' time up in Manchester where we want to try and share some good news stories, as well as try and tackle some of the challenges. So I think it's an important role just to celebrate all the good things that are happening.
I just want to finish off the same question to everyone, really, and it occurs to me there's been a lot of focus inevitably on battery power on electric vehicles, but equally a number of you have talked about the potential, if I can put it like that, for hydrogen, and particularly when you consider that it probably takes the same time to refuel with hydrogen than it does for diesel. Why aren't we looking at that more closely? And everything seems to come back to electrical with all the attendant challenges that faces, and it may be that there are just as many with hydrogen. So Tom, what's your view on that? And we've got about 3 minutes left, so I'll have to ask you to be very brief, all of you.
Sure, I will. I'll try to keep it short. At the GFI, we are technology agnostic. We're basically interested in supporting technologies that are ready to scale and supporting the flow of finance where the technology is ready to be financed. And at the moment, that's batteries. When it comes to HEVs, it's when we're speaking to lenders and investors, hydrogen poses a much higher risk, and there's quite a few different challenges that need to still be addressed when it comes to hydrogen. The cost of production is really high. That there still needs to be infrastructure created to distribute it, and then also that there's further challenges around actually creating green or sustainable hydrogen. So basically there's more challenges remaining than there are currently with battery electric, and for that reason, from a finance perspective, electric is much easier to deal with.
Thanks, Tom. Alistair, hydrogen, yes or no going forward?
It's not quite as simple as that, right? It's not a sort of which one's going to win. There will be a balance. There will be both. The reason I think that battery is going to take the lion's share of it is that the total cost of ownership is projected by most to be significantly lower. So for operations or routes that you can do with battery electric vehicles, you simply wouldn't afford to spend the money to do those with hydrogen fuel cell. So that's the main reason behind it. Yeah, it's not as simple as it won't be one and it won't be the other. It'll be a mixture, but we'll only use hydrogen where it makes economic sense to.
And your view on that, Phil?
I agree with Alistair and Tom. Basically, hydrogen is late to the party, so we haven't seen the investment in it. I'm confident that the cost of and the efficiency of hydrogen for transport will improve over time, but electrification started 15 years ago. There are use cases where I can't imagine that electric vehicles will be the most appropriate option, but hydrogen has yet to prove that because it hasn't had the same investment as electric.
Thanks very much, Phil, and thanks all of our panelists. We've run out of time, as we often do in these sessions. I just want to thank everyone for their insights this morning. Dr. Alistair Barnes from Innovate UK, Tom Parke from the Green Finance Institute, and Professor Phil Blythe the Professor of Intelligent Transport Systems at Newcastle University, and the DARE Hub. Do check out our website, decarbonisingtransportweek.com, for more information on Tom, Alistair's and Phil's organisations. There's a wealth of information on there for you. And for those joining us for our next keynote interview, just log off and log back on again via the new link. So thanks again for everyone joining this session, and we'll see you at another session very shortly. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.